On August 18, 2026, Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding, brokered through months of Pakistani and Qatari mediation, meant to convert an unstable ceasefire into something durable. The deal extended the truce, laid out a path toward reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and set a 60-day window for the harder negotiations, sanctions, frozen assets, and eventually the nuclear program to follow. The first working-level session under that new framework was scheduled for the very next day, June 19th, at the Bergenstock Resort above Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. Vice President J.D. Vance had his delegation ready to fly. Then, less than 24 hours after the ink dried in Islamabad, the talks were postponed. Switzerland's foreign ministry confirmed the delay without offering a new date. Vance canceled his trip. And the reason had nothing to do with uranium enrichment levels or missile inventories. It had to do with Lebanon. In the hours after the memorandum was signed, Israel launched a fresh wave of strikes in southern Lebanon, saying it was responding to a Hezbollah attack that killed several Israeli soldiers, including a senior commander. Lebanon's health ministry reported 18 people killed in the strikes that followed. Netanyahu, in a public post, said he'd ordered the Israeli military to hit Hezbollah with full force. Iran's delegation, according to a regional diplomat briefed on the situation, told mediators it wanted assurance that the fighting in Lebanon would actually stop in line with the new agreement before its officials would sit down in Switzerland. A ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was reached later that same Friday, and Vance did eventually fly out, landing in Switzerland that Sunday to join envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner for the rescheduled talks. But the sequence itself, a brand new memorandum nearly derailed within a single day by fighting in a country that isn't even a party to it, tells you something the headlines mostly flattened into a simpler story about Iranian obstruction. To understand why Lebanon kept becoming the trigger point, you have to go back to how this dispute started, because it didn't begin in June, it began in April, at the very first ceasefire, and it never actually got resolved. When Trump initially announced a 2-week pause in the fighting back in April, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi treated Lebanon as included in that truce, pointing to language from Pakistan's prime minister, who had brokered it, explicitly naming Lebanon in the ceasefire terms. The White House disagreed. Vance told reporters in Hungary that the United States never once said Lebanon was part of the deal, and warned that it would be dumb of Iran to let the whole negotiation collapse over a country he described as having nothing to do with the core Iran-US dispute. Israel's own government position was blunter still. Netanyahu's office said explicitly that its ceasefire with Iran did not extend to the separate war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. That April disagreement was never cleanly settled. It was papered over well enough to keep talks moving, and then it resurfaced in June as the exact same argument, because the underlying ambiguity in the text had never actually been fixed. That's the pattern worth sitting with because it recurred a third time later that same week. Iran's Revolutionary Guard, in the days immediately following the Switzerland session, announced it was closing the Strait of Hormuz again, even as the broader 60-day negotiating extension was supposedly in effect, a move Al Jazeera's coverage from inside the Bergenstock talks described as opening new fissures just as delegations were trying to build momentum. Trump, according to reporting from that period, was making public threats even as the talks proceeded, and Israel continued operating in Lebanon in ways Iran read as inconsistent with what it believed the memorandum required. 3 separate moments, April, June 19th, and the days right after, each one following the identical shape. Washington and Tehran reach some form of understanding, Israel takes action in Lebanon that Iran views as violating it, and the broader negotiation stalls until the Lebanon question gets addressed, however temporarily, before anything else can move forward. There's a straightforward, ungenerous read of this pattern, and it's the one most coverage reached for in the moment, that Iran was using Lebanon as a pretext, manufacturing objections to stall a process it never intended to complete in good faith. That reading isn't unreasonable on its face. Stalling tactics in high-stakes negotiations are common enough, and a party looking for an excuse to walk away rarely struggles to find one. But it has to explain why the same objection kept recurring across 3 separate moments, months apart, always triggered by the same specific fact pattern. Renewed Israeli military action in Lebanon, a country that isn't a signatory to any of the agreements being negotiated, and that Iran has repeatedly said it understood to be covered by the ceasefire language, regardless of Washington's disagreement. A manufactured pretext usually varies its shape to fit the moment. This one didn't. It was the same dispute, unresolved from April, resurfacing on a predictable trigger every time Israeli operations in Lebanon intensified. There's a more structural way to understand what Iran was actually testing here, and it has less to do with Lebanon itself than with a question underneath the entire negotiation: whether the United States can actually deliver on commitments that depend on restraining an ally who isn't formally bound by the paper Washington signs. Israel was never a signatory to the April ceasefire or the June memorandum. Both documents were negotiated and signed by the United States and Iran, with Pakistan and Qatar mediating. That structure creates a real asymmetry. When Iran commits to something under the memorandum, the Iranian state itself is bound. When the United States commits to something that depends on Israeli behavior, a halt to strikes in Lebanon, for instance, Washington is making a promise about a third party's conduct that it doesn't have direct unilateral control over. Vance himself, in the days around the postponed Switzerland talks, publicly warned Israel not to undermine the agreement, telling reporters at one point that the U.S. remained Israel's only powerful ally left in the entire world. A warning, notably, not a directive, and one that still didn't stop the Lebanon strikes that forced the postponement in the first place. That gap between what Washington can promise and what it can actually enforce on its own coalition partner is, from Iran's side, a rational thing to want tested before committing to a 60-day negotiating track that leads toward far higher stakes questions: sanctions relief, frozen assets, and eventually the nuclear program itself. If the United States can't get Israel to hold off strikes in Lebanon for even the first 72 hours after a memorandum is signed, that's directly relevant information about how much confidence Iran should place in any American commitment made later in the process, when the stakes are considerably higher than a shipping corridor or a temporary lull in one theater. Researchers following the talks made a version of this point directly at the time, that Iran's repeated insistence on Lebanon functioned less as sabotage than as a genuine effort to establish empirically whether Washington could actually restrain its own coalition before Tehran extended more trust into the harder phases of the negotiation. It's worth taking the other side seriously too, because Vance's frustration wasn't unreasonable on its own terms. The textual ambiguity here is real. Lebanon's status under the April and June agreements genuinely was disputed language, not a settled provision Israel was unambiguously violating, and the American position that Lebanon fell outside the core Iran-focused ceasefire has some basis in how the deal was actually negotiated and worded. A negotiation this consequential, covering sanctions, frozen assets, and eventually a nuclear program, arguably shouldn't be allowed to repeatedly stall over a genuinely contested side issue, however serious the underlying violence in Lebanon was. There's a coherent case that both sides bear some responsibility for never resolving the Lebanon ambiguity cleanly the first time it came up in April, and that Iran, having accepted the same imprecise language a second time in June, shares some responsibility for the fact that it kept resurfacing. What that argument has more difficulty accounting for is the actual human cost sitting inside the dispute Vance was calling a distraction. This wasn't an abstract legal disagreement over contract language. Lebanon's health ministry reported dozens of deaths in the specific strikes that derailed the Switzerland talks, and the broader Israel-Hezbollah escalation in the weeks around the April ceasefire produced casualty figures in the hundreds, with reporting at the time noting one of the highest single-day death tolls of that entire phase of the conflict. Iran's position, that a ceasefire process shouldn't proceed smoothly while an allied military continues an active bombing campaign nearby, is not obviously less reasonable than the American position that the two issues should be treated as separable. Calling that insistence dumb, as Vance did, treats a live military conflict with a substantial death toll as a negotiating inconvenience rather than a legitimate reason for one party to want assurances before proceeding. Whether or not Iran's approach was the optimal negotiating strategy, dismissing the underlying concern as bad faith requires setting aside how much was actually happening on the ground in Lebanon each time the dispute recurred. Where this leaves the broader memorandum is genuinely unresolved, and it's worth being honest about the limits of what's knowable from outside the room. What's documented is a repeating structural pattern, a negotiating framework between two governments, repeatedly destabilized by the actions of a third party that isn't bound by its terms, with the government whose ally is causing the disruption asking the other side to simply trust that it will eventually get things under control. That's a genuinely difficult position for any negotiator to accept at face value, and Iran's decision to keep testing it, rather than proceeding on faith, is defensible as ordinary diplomatic caution rather than obstruction, even if it's also true that Washington had real, understandable reasons to find the repeated stalling frustrating, given everything else riding on the deal moving forward. Both things can be true. The Lebanon dispute was never really about Lebanon in isolation. It was about whether a promise from Washington means anything when the actor most likely to break it isn't the one holding the pen.